A woman walks into Nero Wolfe's brownstone, trembling beneath the weight of a murder she swears she didn't commit. Outside, the city hums with indifference, but inside, reason sharpens its blade. Lies, ledgers, and loyalty will twist together until truth itself must stand trial. In a world where even syntax can betray a man, justice won't come quietly. It will be deduced. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. It was 11:30, and the brownstone had settled into its preferred temperature of silence. Wolfe was upstairs among his orchids, leaving me and the typewriter to a peaceful stalemate. I was halfway through a letter I didn't intend to mail when the doorbell rang. Not the patient, one finger tap of a client who's paid in advance, but the nervous peck of a bird that's lost its nest. I opened it to find a young woman whose expression carried more tremor than rouge. When I told her Mr. Wolfe was occupied with his orchids and his conscience, she said she'd wait. That was my first clue she was desperate. Nobody in his right mind volunteers to wait for Wolfe. When he finally came down, eyes sharp as if they'd just pruned something thorny, I gave him the usual warning. Visitor. Female. Looks fragile enough to break under your vocabulary. His sigh travelled the length of the room before he reached the desk. Archie. My morning is devoted to Flora, not melodrama. Yeah, I said, but she looks like the melodrama might already have happened. That earned me a glare fit to sterilize an orchid. She stepped into the office like she'd been called to judgment, clutching a worn handbag as if it were the last barrier between her and confession. Her voice shook, but her eyes tried to hold steady. Mr. Wolfe, they'll say I killed him, but I didn't. I couldn't. I leaned against the filing cabinet. Lady, you'll have to narrow it down. People get killed in this city every 7 minutes. Wolfe scowled at me. Not for the joke, but because she chose to answer. My employer, Mr. Roston, he's dead. They'll think it was me. The tremor got worse halfway through his name. Wolfe's fingers drummed the desk like they were conducting an invisible orchestra of logic. If you are innocent, miss, that is commendable. It does not, however, require my participation. I saw her knuckles whiten. She was scared, not sly. The kind of fear that doesn't rehearse. I said, maybe you should tell us why anyone would think you did it before the inspector gets his own version. Wolfe's sigh was heavy enough to depress the barometer. Archie, your enthusiasm for tragedy is unseemly. Proceed, madam, but do attempt brevity. Her words came in fragments, the way truth usually does when it's been cornered. A building on 38th Street. A small import firm. A man found in his locked office with a ledger missing. Gossip already in circulation. The office clerk, the girl in question, had been the last to see him alive. I kept my face straight, though her details had holes big enough to drive Fritz's grocery cart through. So, your boss is dead, a ledger's gone, and you're the lucky one with the key. Anything else we should know before Kramer starts his parade? She hesitated. I heard noises that night, voices in the corridor, but everyone denies being there. Wolfe's chair creaked. That's as close as he gets to emotional investment. Madam, you present a tangle of supposition and sentiment. It does not interest me. That hit her harder than it should have. She looked at me, not him, and said quietly, Then I'm already finished. I didn't like the sound of that. Wolfe might not believe in instinct, but I've made a living out of it. Hers said she wasn't lying, just drowning. Wolfe leaned back, hands folded across the landscape of his vest. Archie, what she requests is empathy, which is unprofitable. We are not a bureau of absolution. Sure, I said, but you might try being human once in a while. She's scared. She is hysterical. Hysteria is a contagion. I prefer immunity. He turned to her, the tone clipped as if carved from marble. I shall not act upon conjecture. Facts first, emotion later, or never. Her lips parted, but no sound came. I said, "Maybe we should let Kramer play butcher first, then we can step in later and charge double for resurrection." That earned me a slow glance that meant shut up before I became his next philosophical metaphor. Wolfe reached for his beer, took a long swallow and muttered, "Moral cowardice is not my flaw, Archie. Indiscretion is yours." I didn't argue. You don't wrestle a man who wins every round without standing. The girl, seeing the door half closed against her, tried one last push. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "my employer handled accounts for Mr. Emil Harbach, the importer." That name did something no argument could. Wolfe froze mid-sip, eyes narrowing to two slits of calculation. Emil Harbach had crossed our threshold once, years ago, and left minus a fortune and a reputation after trying to cheat Wolfe on a fee. He set the glass down gently. "Harbach?" His tone could have chilled a furnace. "You are certain?" "Yes. I saw his signature in the books myself." I couldn't help a grin. There it is, the magic word. Silence, Archie. His voice had dropped to that velvet register that means his curiosity just signed a contract his pride will have to honor. "Madam, I shall permit 5 more minutes of your incoherence." For the first time, she almost smiled. Fear, when shared with a genius, always looks like relief. The questioning changed flavor. Wolfe no longer dismissed her words. He sifted them, separating what she believed from what she merely feared. "When you left the office," he asked, "did anyone see you?" She hesitated. "The night watchman, but he was half asleep." "Men who nap seldom dream of murder," Wolfe murmured. "What did you take from the office?" "Nothing." He nodded once, satisfied, which meant he was far from it. "And this missing ledger, describe it." "Black cover, torn corner, kept in the bottom drawer. Mr. Roston locked it every night. Archie Goodwin might not know all the tricks, but I knew that tone." Wolfe was pretending indifference while memorizing every syllable. When she faltered again, he said, "Miss, deceit is an art. Yours is amateurish. Be honest henceforth." She nodded, cheeks coloring. I almost pitied her. Wolfe's courtesy can skin you without raising his voice. When she'd finished, Wolfe leaned back, shut his eyes, and let silence run the room. Then, with the weight of a man resigning himself to calamity, he spoke. "Very well. Archie, note the particulars. We shall investigate." The girl gasped, as if he'd handed her a pardon. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Wolfe." "Do not thank me," he said. "Gratitude is premature until justice proves worth the trouble." I escorted her to the door, gave her a reassuring grin, and promised to call by morning. When I came back, Wolfe was already reaching for the dictionary, which meant the world could collapse quietly as long as his vocabulary remained intact. "You'll never admit it," I said, "but you're intrigued." He frowned at me. "Archie, you mistake curiosity for folly. I am indulging the latter." "Sure," I said, reaching for my hat, "and I'm just a stenographer." As I left, he muttered, "Archie, order veal cutlets for dinner. We may require fortification." That was Wolfe's way of declaring war. If there was a prize for architectural dishonesty, the building on 38th Street would have taken the cup and demanded a rematch. It was one of those midtown hybrids, half office, half fire trap, with corridors that twisted like an argument and doors that led to other doors as if privacy were a contagious disease. I'd been in plenty of setups where the rooms told lies about the people inside, but this one was unusually verbose. The murdered man's office was on the 3rd floor, left of a stairwell that could have doubled as an echo chamber. I started my tour like a census taker with a conscience, checking who belonged where and how far they'd go to prove it. Every tenant I met had an alibi polished and ready, like a Sunday shoe. They were polite, nervous, and unanimously cooperative, which meant none of them could be trusted. I made a rough floor sketch in my notebook, not because Wolfe had asked for one, but because I already knew he'd ask why I hadn't. Each door had its own personality, some too eager to close, some too lazy to open. It was the kind of place where you'd need breadcrumbs to find the men's room. The janitor was sweeping the hall like he was punishing the dust for gossiping. He was built like a retired boxer and talked like a preacher who'd lost his congregation but kept the voice. "I told the police," he began, leaning on his broom like it had sworn loyalty. "I heard the shot clear as sin, but it bounced. Echoed, you know. Could have come from any direction." I said, "You mean it came from somewhere between heaven and hell?" He grinned, showing a single gold tooth that looked like it had wandered in by mistake. "You could say that. These walls carry sound. That's why I mind my own business. Sound goes where it wants. Same with people." That last line had potential, but he didn't elaborate. I asked about the tenants. He gave me a list of first names and bad habits: the typist who cried too much, the salesman who never stopped talking, and the quiet guy who kept his door locked even when he wasn't in. "Funny thing," he added, lowering his voice. "The dead man had visitors late. Didn't see who. Heard voices, then the shot. Like I said, walls lie." He went back to sweeping. Gospel delivered. Sermon concluded. I moved on, notebook filling faster than my patience. The typist sat behind a desk covered in more paper than confidence. She was small, blonde, and shaking slightly, which meant she either knew something or had just discovered caffeine. I introduced myself as an insurance investigator. It's the only title that earns confessions and respect in equal measure. "I didn't hear anything," she said quickly. "Only a thud. But it could have been anything. A drawer, or maybe I dropped my pencil." "Did you check?" I asked. No." Her eyes darted to the floor, then the wall. "I was upset. My boyfriend, we'd quarreled. I may have been crying. I don't really remember." "Crying can do that," I said. "Blurs sound and judgment both." She gave me a wounded look, but I've been stared at by better actresses. I jotted it down anyway, not because she was lying, but because she'd given me a reason not to trust her memory. Before I left, she blurted out, "But I saw Mr. Roston that afternoon. He looked nervous, like he was expecting someone unpleasant." I smiled. "You're improving. Keep that up, and I'll start thinking you heard the truth after all." The next office was run by a salesman who wore cologne like armor and a grin that hadn't met sincerity in years. "Now, Mr. Goodwin," he said, gesturing me to sit. "You'll want to know exactly where I was when the tragedy occurred. I was right here, on the phone with a client. Ask anyone." I asked, "Anyone in particular? Or just anyone with a phone?" He ignored that. "I even checked the time myself. This clock never lies." He pointed to a shiny desk model ticking smugly beside his elbow. I nodded toward the door. "You mean the clock in the hall? Because that one's 3 minutes faster." His grin faltered. "Can't be. I set mine to the radio every morning." "Maybe the radio lies too." He bristled. "I'm a salesman, not a mechanic." "That's a comfort." I thanked him for his civic duty to punctuality and noted his clock discrepancy. Wolfe would enjoy it. He always said murderers and salesmen share one trait. Both believe timing is everything. As I stepped back into the hallway, I noticed a draft where no draft should be. At first glance, it looked like a shadow line in the plaster. But closer inspection revealed a thin outline of a door, narrow and half swallowed by the wall between the salesman's office and the one adjoining it, the dead man's. The hinges had been painted over years ago, but the paint was cracked and fresh near the handle. I touched it lightly. It didn't move, but the scuff marks on the floor said it had. Recently. I crouched to check the molding. A small streak of reddish dust caught my eye. Brick powder, from the kind used to seal old partitions. Someone had scraped this door open and shut again in a hurry. I made a note in my book, then whistled softly. "A sealed door that isn't sealed," I muttered. "Now that's character." Behind me, the janitor's broom resumed its sermon somewhere down the hall. I had the funny feeling he wasn't sweeping dust anymore, just listening. The water cooler was the social hub of the floor. Every office has one, the place where truth and fiction dissolve at the same rate. 2 clerks were there, whispering like schoolgirls. I introduced myself with a grin and a paper cup. One said, "Oh, that poor man. I heard he had a woman visitor, didn't he?" The other smirked. "Of course he did. That one from the second floor, the brunette with the big eyes. She was always sneaking in." "Funny," I said. "The janitor didn't mention her." "He wouldn't," one replied. "He's sweet on her." That was a new angle. Janitors don't usually make cameo appearances in romantic subplots. I played dumb, asked a few more casual questions, and walked away with a pocketful of contradictions. If gossip were currency, 38th Street was a bank. Back at the stairwell, I compared notes, and one inconsistency winked at me from the page. It hit me halfway down the stairs. Every story, the janitor's timing, the salesman's call, the typist's thud, depended on one silent witness, the hallway clock. The same clock the salesman swore was wrong, and the janitor claimed echoed the time of the shot. I went back up, checked the clock's casing. Fresh scratches near the adjustment knob, small but deliberate. Someone had changed the time recently, and not for daylight savings. It made sense. A good alibi doesn't need imagination. It just needs a clock that keeps its mouth shut. I leaned against the wall, scribbling fast. Wolfe had a phrase for this sort of thing. When men lie, the universe politely adjusts itself. I didn't quote him aloud, but I grinned. By the time I stepped into the street, the fog had started to thicken, and I knew one thing for sure, that building had more doors than truths, and at least one of them was wide open. The bell rang like someone wanted to wake the dead, which, considering the business we were in that week, wasn't the friendliest symbolism. I was halfway to the door when the knob turned itself, and Inspector Kramer came through as if he'd bought the building and forgotten to tell us. He had the kind of grin that usually means bad news for somebody, and from the way his eyes slid over me, that somebody wasn't him. "Well," he said, slapping his hat against his thigh, "you can tell your genius boss. He can save his breath. The girl's in custody. Open and shut, Goodwin." I leaned on the jamb and gave him my best, welcoming smile. If I tell him that, Inspector, he'll just ask for proof. And knowing you, it'll be a long evening for the English language. He grunted, brushed past me, and stomped toward the office. The man had all the subtlety of a jackhammer in prayer. Wolfe looked up from his desk with the slow disapproval of a man interrupted mid-meal, which, in his moral philosophy, was worse than mid-thought. Kramer planted himself on the rug like a flag of conquest. "Case closed, Wolfe. Now, I've seen diplomacy murdered in cold blood, but Kramer always preferred to bury it alive." Fritz had just come in with Wolfe's afternoon beer, took one look at the intruder's shoes, wet, square-toed, and maliciously muddy, and retreated without a sound. You can't blame him. Fritz's affection for carpets ranks just below his affection for soufflé. I said, "Inspector, one of these days you'll invent knocking. It's a simple device, makes a small sound, alerts civilized people before they have to inhale your cologne." "Shut up, Goodwin," Kramer growled. "I'm here on business." "Imagine my relief," I said. "I thought you were just casing the drapes." That earned me a look, but Wolfe's raised hand stopped him from barking. "Archie," Wolfe murmured, "since Inspector Kramer has taken the liberty of entering uninvited, you may as well provide him with a chair, one without arms preferably." Kramer sat, scowling, the picture of patience on life support. Kramer opened his mouth to start the victory speech he'd rehearsed all the way from Center Street, but Wolfe cut him off before the first syllable had a chance to crawl. "You may proceed, Inspector," Wolfe said mildly, "but I must warn you, I am allergic to premature certainty." Kramer's jaw tightened. "You're always allergic to something, Wolfe. This time, you're allergic to being wrong. Your client confessed by omission, motive, opportunity, fingerprints. The whole package. Pui, Wolfe said, without raising an eyelid. You are confusing what is visible with what is valid. Kramer leaned forward. You think you're smarter than the whole department. I think, Wolfe replied, voice silk over steel, that your department suffers from a chronic ailment. Exuberant confidence unsupported by intellect. It must be exhausting. I watched the temperature rise. When Wolfe was that calm, he could melt glaciers. Kramer, on the other hand, was turning the color of raw beef. He was about to bite, and Wolfe knew it. All right, you smug walrus, Kramer barked, slapping a folder onto Wolfe's desk. You want evidence? I'll give you evidence. First, motive. The girl gets fired, goes back that night to demand money. He laughs in her face. She snaps. Wolfe shifted in his chair, not from agitation, but to adjust the beer glass an inch closer to perfection. A touching narrative, he said, but unsupported by psychology. She exhibits anxiety, not wrath. Continue. Kramer stabbed a finger at the folder. Opportunity. She had a key. The night watchman saw her leave minutes after the estimated time of death. Estimated by whom? Wolfe asked. The medical examiner. Ah, yes. The art of guessing with a stopwatch. Proceed. Fingerprints, Kramer snapped. On the desk drawer where the murder weapon was found. Wolfe closed his eyes as if savouring a fine absurdity. Of course they were. She worked there, did she not? Would you prefer she wore gloves to type? I nearly applauded, but Kramer was on his second wind. And the ledger she mentioned, missing. You think that's coincidence? No, Wolfe said smoothly. Coincidence implies randomness. This is design, but not hers. Kramer's hand clenched. I could hear the skin stretch. Wolfe had taken his case apart the way a cat unravels a ball of yarn, neatly and with contempt. Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled, voice patient as a schoolmaster. Inspector, you presume a woman of that disposition, mild, fearful, deferential, would commit murder in so unconsidered a fashion. No. Her temperament forbids it. To kill, one must first dare to hate. She has not that vigour. Kramer sneered. You think you can read souls now? I read patterns, Wolfe said. You, on the other hand, read headlines. That did it. Kramer's ears went scarlet. I don't have to stand here and listen to your mouth. You are seated, Wolfe corrected him. Remain so. It will prevent unnecessary circulation of blood to the head. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from grinning. Wolfe was at his best when he treated an argument like a recital, every insult tuned to perfect pitch. The evidence against her, Wolfe continued, is a monument of supposition. You have built it well, Inspector. Sturdy, impressive, and entirely hollow. If verbal combat were a sport, Wolfe would have been heavyweight champion of the world, and Kramer would have been carried out by the referees. I kept my own mental tally as they went at it. Logic, 5. Authority, 0. Wolfe was running the table without breaking a sweat. Kramer jabbed the air with a forefinger. You're making excuses for a killer. Not excuses, Wolfe said calmly. Explanations. They differ as intelligence differs from obstinacy. I almost called for popcorn. When Wolfe drew that line, you knew the bout was nearly over. The part where the other man realizes he's still swinging, but the audience has stopped watching. Kramer stood so fast his chair skidded backward, nearly taking out one of Fritz's side tables. You're impossible, Wolfe. The girl's booked, and that's that. Wolfe gave him a look that could have passed for pity, if you squinted. No, Inspector, that is never that. You're wasting your time, Kramer growled. I rarely do, Wolfe said, reaching for his beer. But I confess, your confidence tempts me to make an exception. Kramer's hand twitched toward his hat like he wanted to strangle it. One of these days, he muttered, your arrogance will choke you. I doubt it, Wolfe murmured. Arrogance, unlike incompetence, is rarely fatal. Kramer stomped out, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the window panes. Wolfe lifted his glass, took a slow sip, and sighed. Archie, The inspector's conviction is an insult to intelligence. I shall disprove it at once. Fetch the client's file, and another beer. I went for the files, grinning. When Wolfe calls a case a monumental imbecility, it means the game's finally begun. When Wolfe tells me not to do something, it falls into one of three categories. A, he means it. B, he thinks he means it. Or C, he's testing my literacy. The matter of revisiting the office on 38th Street landed squarely in the third. Archie, he said, waving a dismissive hand toward the air as though brushing off common sense. You will remain here. The police have blundered quite enough without your assistance. Yes, sir, I said, because that's the kind of man I am, obedient to the letter and uncooperative to the spirit. By the time he was halfway up the stairs to his orchids, I was dialing the number for the building superintendent. A little charm, a forged errand, retrieving a client's misplaced invoice. And I had an appointment with a conscience that squeaked louder than its hinges. If Wolfe later called it defiance, I'd call it discretionary initiative. It sounds better in a report. The custodian was a man whose life philosophy could be summed up as sweep enough and nobody sweeps back. When I showed him Wolfe's engraved business card and explained that one of our clients had left important papers in the late Mr. Roston's desk, his moral compass started spinning like a roulette wheel. Police said the office is sealed, he muttered, scratching the back of his neck. Police also said the Titanic was unsinkable, I told him. This is between you, me, and whatever you're drinking after work. He hesitated just long enough to look honest, then produced a key that jingled like guilt on a keychain. 10 minutes, he warned. Plenty, I said. I only need 5 to disappoint you. He followed me inside, but stayed near the door, pretending to dust while I pretended to look for invoices. People who feel guilty are always helpful. It's their way of writing a confession without ink. The office looked the same. Same stale air, same calendar stuck on last month, same faint odour of worry that hadn't aired out yet. But desks don't lie as politely as people do, and this one had something to say. The bottom drawer on the right had fresh scratches near the lock, the kind made by a key that didn't fit but tried anyway. I gave it a tug. It didn't move. I smiled. The best drawers never do. I slipped my knife from my pocket, the one that's opened more mysteries than mail, and coaxed the latch with a patience Wolfe would have called Archie's only virtue. A soft click rewarded me. Inside was the usual office debris, pencils sharpened to extinction, unpaid bills, and a dried flower that must have died of boredom. But there was also a folder, plain brown, bound with rubber bands, heavy enough to make a paperweight jealous. When I lifted it, I felt the faint stick of glue residue on the underside. Someone had tried to hide this where honesty couldn't reach it. The folder held a small ledger, unmarked, unremarkable, and untrustworthy. Inside, rows of numbers danced with initials like partners at a dishonest waltz. Each entry had been written in 2 inks, one old, one fresh, and all of it smelled faintly of Wolfe's favourite perfume. Deceit in arithmetic form. You could tell it wasn't an official company record. Real accountants use neat columns and plausible explanations. This one was a scrapbook of secrets. Payments not filed, names half erased, and amounts round enough to roll under a conscience. I flipped a few pages, scanning initials that didn't belong together. Some matched what our late Mr. Roston might have owed to consultants. Others were small, irregular, hush money, or something worse. My intuition, which has saved both my hide and Wolfe's reputation more than once, told me I was holding the kind of book people kill to keep shut, and the ink, still slightly tacky, suggested the killer might not be done editing. Halfway through the ledger, my eyes stopped cold. On the right margin, beside a payment entry, was a name written out in full, careless, hurried, and horribly familiar. Harvey Lott. That name hadn't crossed my path in 2 years, and even then, it had crawled. Lott was a blackmailer who'd slipped through Wolfe's net by turning on his own client before we could turn him in. He'd vanished after that, The kind of disappearance only money or mortality could buy. Seeing his name again in the ledger was like finding a fingerprint on a ghost. Next to it, an amount that would have bought a new Buick and a silence to go with it. For a minute, I just sat there, staring at the neat curve of the H. You don't expect the dead to reappear in ink, especially not in ledgers written by other dead men. The custodian coughed in the doorway. I shut the book, nodded, and told him I'd found what I needed. My smile must have looked convincing. It usually does when I'm thinking of murder. Back at the brownstone, the aroma of butter and catastrophe met me at the door. Fritz emerged from the kitchen, waving a wooden spoon like a priest brandishing a relic. "Archie!" he cried. "The dumplings! They have suffered. Mr. Wolfe will be heartbroken. I cannot serve regret." I slipped the ledger under a cushion on the red chair and said, "You'd better hide that grief. He's already got plenty of indigestion from the police." Fritz frowned. A man must digest both food and conscience carefully. Otherwise, he grows heavy in the soul. "Thanks," I said. "I'll mention that to the murderer next time I see him." He blinked, unsure if I was joking. Before he could press the matter, Wolfe's bell rang from the office. Fritz hurried off, muttering about moral digestion, while I fished out the ledger again, my stomach performing tricks of its own. When I finally handed Wolfe the ledger, he didn't thank me, which is his version of a standing ovation. He flipped through the pages like a man turning over stones to see which insect bites first. After a minute, he smiled. That small, tight-lipped smile that means he's either found the key or the lock. "The living," he said softly, "often forget the dead keep better accounts." I said, "That's one way to put it. Another is that our corpse had more clients than the yellow pages." He ignored me, closed the ledger, and reached for his beer. "Archie," he murmured, "remind me to thank the murderer. Eventually. His incompetence has improved my appetite." That was my cue to prepare for trouble. When Nero Wolfe's appetite improves, someone else's peace of mind doesn't. Wolfe's instructions had been as clear as a foghorn in the Bronx. "Observe without presumption," he said, which meant I could spend all afternoon being hungry, provided I didn't assume anything about it. So there I was, holding down a stool at the lunch counter opposite Roston's office, pretending to read the Gazette while the waitress wiped circles into the counter for no one in particular. The place smelled of coffee and overconfidence. The usual crowd of secretaries and salesmen buzzed around, talking about the murder like it was a civic event. I ordered a ham on rye, because if you're going to listen to gossip, you might as well do it with something that doesn't insult your intelligence. Through the window, I could see the building where Roston had met his final deadline. A few blinds were drawn, others quivered as curious tenants tried to look normal. My stomach growled, and I told it to behave. You can't interrogate on an empty conscience. Wolfe's idea of surveillance might be sedentary, but mine came with mustard. About 20 minutes into my impersonation of a man with nowhere better to be, the door jingled and in came a familiar face. Victor Brand, the late Roston's accountant. He had the kind of genial face people trust until the bill arrives. He ordered a tuna melt and coffee, then took the stool 2 down from mine. "Terrible business, that murder," he said to no one in particular, which meant he was talking to me. I folded my paper with professional reluctance. "Can't open a paper without seeing it," I said. "You knew him?" He sighed like a man who's practiced sorrow in front of a mirror. "I did. Fine employer, though difficult. I suppose the police have their theories." He waited for me to ask. I didn't. That didn't stop him. "They're saying it was someone from the office." Absurd, of course. Miss Doyle's in custody, poor girl. Innocent as springtime. He spoke too warmly, too soon. Grief doesn't usually come with a sales pitch. I was buttering my roll with one hand and filing away his words with the other, mentally, of course, when he said it. She must have used the gun from the bottom drawer. Now that was interesting. The police hadn't released that little detail yet. Kramer's mouth might leak like a faulty radiator, but even he wasn't that careless. I looked up slowly. You mean the murder weapon? He hesitated. Too late. Well, yes. That's what I heard. I mean, that's what they say. Who's they? He shrugged, chewing his sandwich like it held the answer. People talk. Sure, I said, but they usually need something to start with. He smiled blandly, the kind that hides behind numbers. You'd be surprised what people hear in this city. I would, but not today. His syntax had slipped. Past, tense for knowledge he shouldn't have had yet. Wolfe would have called it a verbal fingerprint. I called it a reason to skip dessert. As Brand left a tip and waddled out, the waitress leaned over and lowered her voice. Funny bird, that one. Comes here every day since the killing. Orders the same thing. Talks the same talk. I fished a quarter from my pocket and dropped it beside her register. Talks to who? She shrugged. Whoever's listening. But it's like he wants someone to overhear. Same lines, same pauses. Yesterday, it was a newspaper man. Today, you. That tightened things. Rehearsed grief is one thing. Premeditated chatter is another. I thanked her with a smile that probably deserved a better lunch and headed for the door. The quarter bought me a clue, which was a fair rate in this economy. Outside, the air had that stale chill that always follows a murder and a bad tuna melt. I crossed to the payphone booth by the corner drugstore and picked up the receiver. I wasn't calling anyone, I just wanted the reflection in the glass. Brand was still there, standing on the sidewalk, talking to a man I couldn't quite place. Their posture screamed rehearsal, deliberate, timed, symmetrical. I watched long enough to notice something Wolfe would have appreciated. Rhythm. Brand gestured, paused, nodded. The other man responded on cue. It wasn't a conversation. It was a performance with dialogue written for an audience of one. Me. I hung up, stepped outside, and lit a cigarette to give my brain something to hide behind. The timing, the phrasing, even the sighs had sounded engineered. If words could be fingerprints, this whole show had Wolfe's term all over it. Contrivance. There's nothing more suspicious than perfection. By the time I started back toward the brownstone, my head was replaying that talk like a broken record. Brand hadn't been talking to the waitress, or to me. He'd been performing for anyone who might take the bait. And congratulations to me, I had. A chill came with that thought, not from the wind. I stopped halfway across the street, turned just enough to confirm what I already felt. Across from the diner, through the coffee shop window, a man sat with a cup in front of him, reading a newspaper upside down. Nobody reads the classifieds from the bottom up. He wasn't watching the news. He was watching me. He fit the pattern. Too neat, too patient, too still. His shoes gleamed like they'd been polished by guilt, his coffee untouched, and his posture steady enough to pass for taxidermy. I gave him 3 chances to blink. He didn't take any of them. I pretended not to notice and strolled to the corner, slow and easy. When I risked a glance back, he was still there, pretending to read. It was a good act, but so was mine. Somewhere between irritation and instinct, the hairs on my neck had joined a union. Either the accountant's chatter had been bait, or the bait was me. I couldn't tell which I preferred. Wolfe had once said, "The hunter's mistake is to assume he is not also the hunted." I was beginning to see what he meant. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was mid-dinner, which meant the world was supposed to wait. I didn't. He scowled as I entered. "Archie, you know I detest interruptions during digestion." "You'll detest this less than salmon gone cold," I said, dropping into the chair. Our chatty accountant's been doing daily monologues about the murder. Today's audience was me, and there's a man tailing me who thinks I haven't noticed. Wolfe dabbed his lips, leaned back, and shut his eyes, the way some men pray, but more effective. "A lie that's well rehearsed," he said finally, "is never spontaneous. Therefore, it was performed for an audience." "Yeah," I muttered. "Me." He opened one eye, gleaming with amusement. Then, Archie, you are not the observer. You are the exhibit. That, I think, calls for another beer. I didn't argue. When Wolfe starts enjoying himself, someone else is about to have a miserable evening. If you've ever tried interrupting Nero Wolfe while he's communing with orchids, you'll know it ranks just below suicide and just above treason on his personal scale of idiocy. But I've made a career out of ranking high in his disapproval, so I went ahead anyway. He was standing in the middle of the plant rooms, one hand hovering above a cattleya, as though blessing it. "Sir," I said, keeping my tone just shy of blasphemy, "your private jungle will survive if you spare it 5 minutes." Wolfe grunted, which in his dialect means, "This better be worth it." I gave him the rundown from the lunch counter, the accountant's performance, the watcher with the untasted coffee, and the sense that I'd been handed a script without auditioning for it. He listened with eyes half closed, which might have fooled a stranger into thinking he wasn't interested. But the faint smirk twitching under that moustache told me the opposite. He was interested. He just didn't want to encourage me. We hadn't finished dissecting my report when Fritz appeared in the doorway like a conscience wrapped in linen. "Gentlemen," he began, "I must insist that timing is the essence of good living. The souffle, the cigar, the telephone call, all may fail if mistimed." Wolfe waved him off, but Fritz wasn't built for subtle exits. "Routine is sacred," he added, "and interruptions are assaults upon order. That," I told him, "should be embroidered over the kitchen door." He ignored me, delivered a fresh bottle of beer for Wolfe, and was halfway out when he added, "Still, sometimes it is human timing, not culinary, that decides everything." Wolfe looked up sharply, the bottle frozen mid-air. "Indeed," he murmured, a most suggestive remark. Fritz, satisfied with having thrown philosophical breadcrumbs behind him, departed. Wolfe set the beer down untouched. Something had started blooming in that oversized head of his. "Repeat," Wolfe ordered. I did. Every line from the accountant's lunchtime performance, verb for verb, as best I could remember. He stopped me halfway through and closed his eyes. "The phrase," he said softly, "was, 'She must have used the gun from the bottom drawer,' correct?" "That's right." "Then, Archie, the bloom of falsehood has already wilted. No honest witness says must have when truth is at hand. The verb betrays uncertainty disguised as knowledge." He leaned back, eyes unfocused. "The tense, too. Past necessity instead of present recall. Such phrasing is the refuge of a mind rehearsed, not shocked. You will note, a man who sees does not say must have seen." I whistled low. So the accountant wasn't remembering, he was reciting. Precisely. And recitation is a thing prepared before performance. Wolfe reached for his beer, finally, with the satisfaction of a man watering his logic. He began pacing, slowly, but deliberately, between the orchids and the world globe that served as his favorite prop for enlightenment. When Wolfe paced, it wasn't exercise, it was punctuation. "The accountant," he said, "has revealed himself by rhythm, not reason. The cadence of speech betrays sequence of thought. His sentence structure shows prior arrangement." I watched him circle the desk like a heavyweight dancer, connecting dots only he could see. "Which means," I ventured, "the alibi he spouted was built before the crime happened." Wolfe inclined his head. "Just so. He fabricated a narrative ready for accusation because he expected it." "Expected the murder?" "Or intended it," he replied. "The difference lies in moral proportion, not grammatical." He stopped before an orchid pot and stroked a petal with what looked dangerously like affection. "Deception, Archie, is much like horticulture. It demands cultivation, pruning, and an assumption that no one will notice the symmetry." "Yeah," I said, "but this gardener forgot weeding day." Wolfe turned toward me, eyes glinting under the lamplight. "You mock, but deceit is an art, a garden cultivated by vanity. Every liar designs for beauty, for balance. He arranges motives and actions until they form a pleasing shape. But truth, my dear Archie, is asymmetrical. It will always break through. He paused, letting the words settle like dust after an explosion. That is why even the cleverest liar leaves a corner unswept. Sure, I said, but in my experience, they usually sweep the corner and forget the middle. That earned me a grunt, the Wolfian equivalent of applause. He returned to his chair, folding into it like civilization returning to its throne. Our accountant has painted his deceit with too steady a hand. I shall now disturb his composition. Once Wolfe sits with intent, it means work is about to commence. For me, not him. He dictated the telegrams in the tone of a man composing poetry under duress. To Miss Doyle, to Mr. Brand, to the building's custodian, and Inspector Kramer. The wording: you are requested to attend this evening at my office. The purpose: clarification of a matter touching the Roston affair. Failure to attend may invite undesirable inferences. He looked up. Archie, I trust your delivery will be discreet and swift. Discreet, yes. Swift, maybe. But if Kramer opens the door with a cigar in one hand and a warrant in the other, I'm blaming your wording. He allowed himself a thin smile. Their company will complete my horticultural experiment. Each brings a distinct fragrance of guilt. Fine, I said, reaching for my hat. Then I'll call it what it is. A bouquet of trouble. As I left the office, I could still hear him behind me. The faint shuffle of feet and the creak of the chair as he turned back to his orchids. The man could find serenity in a greenhouse, even while planning psychological arson. I glanced once through the doorway. He was standing among the blossoms, hands behind his back, head inclined slightly, as if listening to their secrets. They mimic innocence, I heard him murmur. But deception, too, needs sunlight. I let the door close quietly. Wolfe's idea of sunlight usually came in the shape of confrontation, and before this one was over, someone was bound to get burned. If you've never seen a lineup of nervous suspects sitting in Nero Wolfe's office, imagine a row of mismatched chess pieces. Some chipped, some shiny, all hoping they're not about to get taken. I had the pleasure of arranging them that evening. Wolfe had specified the order with his usual lack of modesty. The accountant to his right, the most loquacious, the neighbour opposite, the most impressionable, and the others filling in by descending degrees of mendacity. He didn't speak as I ushered them in, just watched from behind his desk like a general awaiting alignment. Mr. Goodwin, he finally said, you may begin when all are in their correct positions for discomfort. They were, though one chair creaked like it was confessing early. I took my post near the globe, ready for Wolfe's opening move. The silence had weight. Even the orchids upstairs would have kept quiet for this. Wolfe folded his hands, the picture of civilized menace. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, my gratitude for your attendance. I trust the inconvenience of this invitation will be redeemed by clarification. The police, in their enthusiasm, have overlooked certain distinctions. We shall repair that deficiency. No one exhaled. Fritz stood in the doorway pretending to monitor air quality, but I caught him glancing nervously at the brandy tray. Wolfe's version of hospitality was a disarming smile followed by mental dissection. The accountant tried a polite chuckle. It died halfway. The neighbour folded her purse in self-defence. I'd seen that posture before, people bracing for impact while hoping to be overlooked. Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closed, as if daring someone to break the silence first. No one did. When he finally spoke again, the voice was soft, but surgical. Mr. Brand, he said, you kept the accounts for Mr. Roston. Would you be so good as to explain this? I handed him the ledger. His fingers trembled as he opened it, which saved me the trouble of subtlety. These entries, Wolfe continued, are written in two hands. The later editions, notably those dated within the last month, are yours. The earlier, Mr. Roston's. The police assumed the changes were clerical. I do not. Brand swallowed hard. He asked me to. No, Wolfe said, cutting him off with a tone polite enough to sting. He could not have asked you, being already deceased. But you, having both opportunity and foreknowledge, attempted to conceal payments made to an unrecorded recipient, yourself. Brand's protest came out strangled. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. The deceit is amateurish. Even forgery requires arithmetic, not imagination. You could have measured the silence in ounces of sweat. Wolfe turned his attention to the woman on the far chair, whose knuckles were clutching her handbag like it might testify against her. Mrs. Cowell, he said gently, you told Inspector Kramer you heard an argument the evening of the murder. Would you repeat the words? She hesitated. He said, "You'll regret this." And she screamed. "No," Wolfe interrupted. "That phrase appears only in the Gazette's morning edition. It was never uttered." Her mouth fell open. I must have... Read it," Wolfe finished for her. "And later convinced yourself you'd heard it. Your contribution to this tableau, while unintentional, was most convenient to the guilty." She wilted into her seat. Fritz coughed discreetly, which was as close as he ever came to moral outrage. At that point, the room was thick enough to slice. The neighbour looked ready to faint. The accountant's tie was performing a slow suicide, and even the janitor in the corner had stopped pretending he wasn't terrified. If guilt had a scent, Wolfe could have bottled it and retired. I'd seen him pull the truth from tighter crowds, but this one was special. All politeness and panic in equal doses. Wolfe, naturally, was serene. "Falsehood," he said idly, "is never as symmetrical as its author imagines." I resisted the urge to applaud. Instead, I made mental footnotes. If the killer didn't crack soon, Fritz might faint before the evening was out. Then Wolfe leaned forward, and the air temperature dropped 10 degrees. "Mr. Brand," he said, "I wish to repeat a line from your earlier statement. She must have used the gun from the bottom drawer. You recall it?" Brand blinked. "Yes, of course." "Indeed, an odd construction. A man who saw nothing speaks with the authority of memory. But let us suppose, merely for sport, that the weapon had been in that drawer all along, placed there days before. The murderer would know where to find it, yes?" Brand's hands twitched. "That's absurd." "It is," Wolfe agreed smoothly, "unless one speaks from preparation rather than hindsight." The poor man froze, realizing his reflex had betrayed him. His eyes darted toward the neighbour, who flinched as if he'd shouted. He hadn't. He didn't need to. Wolfe let the silence breathe, then spoke with the slow relish of a man explaining the obvious. "You see, the phrase 'must have used' condemns you. It presupposes a deduction before the fact. You prepared the narrative before the murder occurred, anticipating suspicion and scripting your own innocence. Such precision in speech cannot coexist with spontaneity." Brand sagged in his chair. Wolfe continued, almost kindly. "Your language betrayed sequence, Mr. Brand. Conception before act, defense before accusation. It is the flaw of all clever liars. They believe grammar is neutral." He turned slightly, catching my eye. "Words, Archie, are the only fingerprints that cannot be wiped." I could have sworn even the orchids upstairs had stopped blooming to listen. Brand's voice, when it came, was small but clear. "He was going to expose me," he said. "Roston found the missing money. I only meant to frighten him, to get time to fix it. The gun went off too easily." He looked around the room like a man already erased. "I changed the ledger afterward. I thought if she, Miss Doyle, looked guilty, they'd stop digging." Wolfe nodded once, neither gloating nor pitying. "Greed masquerading as loyalty," he murmured. "A familiar costume." No one spoke. Even Kramer, who'd have loved to slam cuffs right there, seemed subdued. If guilt ever behaved politely, it did so that night, sitting in our red leather chair, eyes down, waiting for the door to open. When Brand was escorted out, Wolfe exhaled heavily and reached for his beer. "Loyalty," he said, is the most perverted of virtues when it serves profit. It smells worse than deceit unmasked. He took a long drink, the glass clinking softly. Archie, have Fritz bring the cheese. This evening's exertions have earned some compensation. I said, for you or for me? For civilization, he replied. I fetched Fritz. Wolfe leaned back, content, while the orchids upstairs probably smiled. For Nero Wolfe, justice wasn't blind. It was grammatical, and tonight, it had perfect syntax. Inspector Kramer arrived looking like a man who had swallowed his pride and found it unpalatable. He didn't ring the bell so much as attack it. I opened the door and took one look at his face, the kind you see on someone who's just realized he's allergic to crow. Wolfe in? He grunted. In the flesh, I said cheerfully, and a good deal of it. He stomped past me, left muddy tracks on the rug Fritz had polished that morning, and dropped into his usual chair, as though hoping it would break. Wolfe didn't rise, naturally, but inclined his head. Inspector, he said, your punctuality in defeat is almost commendable. Kramer muttered something that sounded like an apology, wearing an insult's coat. I stayed by the desk, enjoying every awkward second. Nothing sweetens a room like Kramer's discomfort after a Wolfe victory. Wolfe set his book aside, steepled his fingers, and began in a tone that promised no survivors. Inspector, I have no quarrel with diligence, but diligence unguided by reason is merely the exertion of ignorance. You mistook conjecture for proof, haste for efficiency, and prejudice for acumen. Kramer's jaw worked, but Wolfe pressed on. What you call intuition is often the refuge of the lazy mind, mental shortcuts taken by men too weary to think. Intellectual decency, sir, demands that one's convictions be earned. I glanced at the clock, wondering if this one would outlast the previous record for longest uninterrupted monologue. Wolfe was rolling, deep in lecture mode, and Kramer's glare couldn't stop him. When he finally paused for air, I said, Translation for the unbaptized. That was a sermon in Latin. Wolfe ignored me. Kramer didn't, but he couldn't argue either. I did not succeed by luck, Wolfe continued, as though Kramer had suggested it. I succeeded because temperament triumphed. Observation is the conscience of the intellect. Without it, logic decays into presumption. He leaned back, eyes half closed, savouring his own phrasing, like Fritz savouring a sauce. You see, Inspector, one must cultivate the habit of perceiving before judging. You judge first, then perceive what fits. Kramer grunted. You make it sound like crime's a parlour game. On the contrary, Wolfe replied evenly, it is an essay in character, and character, Mr. Kramer, never escapes exposure. Kramer pretended not to understand, but the shade of red climbing his neck was a translation in itself. I would have paid good money to frame that blush as a cautionary exhibit on Wolfe's wall. To keep things lively, I threw in my 2 cents. The whole city runs on that system. Nobody looks too closely until the noise stops. Then everyone claims they were about to notice. Wolfe's eyes flicked toward me. Precisely. The noise, Mr. Goodwin, is civilization's lullaby. It permits men to sleep through their own corruption. Kramer snorted. You two ought to put out a philosophy magazine. Too much competition, I said. They already print enough nonsense in yours. That one earned me a sharp side-eye from Wolfe, not for the insult, but for wasting a perfectly good setup line. He prefers his irony aged, not poured. Just when the tension was beginning to smell like ozone, Fritz glided in, tray in hand, looking like the patron saint of sanity. Gentlemen, he said, equilibrium requires nourishment. He set down beer for Wolfe and me, and a glass of water for Kramer, which was either mercy or insult, depending on your perspective. Wolfe inhaled the aroma appreciatively. Mr. Brenner, he said, you have supplied the first sensible observation of the day. Thank you, sir, Fritz said, bowing slightly. Don't thank him too soon, I told him. He'll be claiming credit for your philosophy before dessert. Fritz smiled, modest as always, and retreated. I made a mental note to have his line embroidered for the kitchen wall. Wolfe lifted his glass, studying the foam as though it contained a footnote to civilization. This affair, he pronounced, has restored hygienic balance to the moral intestines of the metropolis, an unpleasant but necessary purgation. Kramer muttered, You make it sound like you cured the city of something. In a sense, Wolfe said, I did. The contagion of stupidity is always epidemic. I raised my glass. Here's to preventive medicine. Wolfe nodded gravely. To moral hygiene. We drank. The beer was cold, the air warm, and the moral intestines of the metropolis were, at least for the moment, disinfected. Of course, I added, the city will spoil it again by morning. Undoubtedly, Wolfe said. That's what keeps us employed. Kramer stood to leave, a defeated soldier, pretending the war hadn't mattered. You'll never change, Wolfe, he said. Nor will the police, Wolfe replied, so balance is maintained. Kramer shot me a look that could have curdled Fritz's cream, then stomped out without saying goodbye. I shut the door behind him, whistling softly. Wolfe resumed his chair, adjusted the lamp, and opened his book. The world restored to its natural orbit. Fritz reappeared to remove the empty glasses, already humming in victory. For a while, silence ruled, that rare and precious species that only survives inside our brownstone. Wolfe read, I thought, and the city outside went on pretending it was awake. Peace, beer, and self-satisfaction. That was the evening's final harmony. Case closed, world unimproved, and all's well within the kingdom of logic and orchids. Justice, when filtered through Nero Wolfe's mind, never arrives with fanfare. It settles quietly, like dust after a storm. The guilty confess not to clear their conscience, but because logic leaves them nowhere else to stand. And yet, in that brownstone on West 35th Street, where orchids bloom above and reason reigns below, every truth feels both victory and loss. Do you believe the killer acted out of greed or something more desperate, something almost human? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.